In the dim and distant past, when I was a small boy, we had a mass tourist industry. I used to often visit my grandmother, who had a boarding house on Castlemona Avenue. During the summer months, there were always two men positioned at the end of Broadway, just outside the Villa Marina. One was a shoe shine, with a chair and numerous brushes, tins of polish and other sold newspapers. He had a loud, deep bullfrog voice and could be heard at some distance, but I could never work out what he was saying. One day my father translated. He had only one cry, and that was, "Big boat in the bay." It was rarely there was a big boat in the bay, but that didn't matter, it sold his newspapers. But he possibly would have been right if he was still with us today, as there are plans and hopes to increase the amount of cruise ships visiting the island, and some of them are very large. Compared to some of the ports of call, our current number is small, but growing. This year, 28 ships were expected, with around about 9,800 passengers. With the deep water berth them, an increase in numbers coming ashore, and an associated spending on transport and souvenirs and high-priced goods, food and drink, all good for the economy, say some. Others have a different view, saying that the background and the infrastructure costs are large, the spend is small, the environmental implications are serious and negative, and damage will be inflicted on our existing tourist business. Well, who's right? Or is there a middle-of-the-road solution? Well, during today's programme, we shall hear from Michael Morrison, who's the Business Development Manager of Marine Services in Orkney. They have some considerable experience with these issues, and they expect to have had 130,000 cruise visitors this year. And he joins us from BBC Radio Orkney. In Douglas, our studio guests are Dr Ross Klein. He's a professor at the Memorial University of Newfoundland and operates a website with the intriguing name Cruise Junkie. He's visiting the island at the invitation of the Positive Action Group. The Minister for the now Department of Enterprise, MHK Laurence Skelly, is with us, and the development of tourism is one of the department's functions, including attracting cruise companies. And the chairman of the Isle of Man Shipping Association, who see benefit increasing the number of cruise ships calling, and believe we should have a deep water berth to accommodate them. And to round it off, Peter Verstage from the Positive Action Group. He's been investigating many of the potential aspects of both positive and negative of increasing the number of cruise ships. Well, there we are. We have a full house today and a programme to develop. But just before I talk to our first guest, which is Ross Klein, let's go all the way up to Orkney and quickly. Michael, good afternoon. Are you there for it with us?
Yes, good afternoon, Roger.
Yes, well, Michael, is it at the beginning of a new season, or have all the ships stopped coming to Orkney now?
We had the last ship here in October, so we're taking a rest until March, Roger.
Yes. And did the numbers come up to your expectations?
Yeah, they certainly did. This year we had around about 130,000 cruise ship passengers over a 7-month period, and around about 135 to 140 ships.
Right. So it was fairly busy. In what sort of period of time? When does the first one come?
The season really starts to kick in round about April, although we get a few early arrivals on the way up to the fjords in March. Yeah. And then the season primarily ends in September, but we do get a few in October as well. I
don't suppose anybody wants to brave the seas at any later than that, would they?
You'd be surprised.
Okay. Right, well, we'll be back with you later. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
Right, now with me in the studio now, as we said before, was Dr Ross Klein. Now, Ross, thank you for joining us. You're here in the Isle of Man, come all this way from Newfoundland at the invitation of the Positive Action Group. But at your university, what do you do? It's not just cruises, is it?
No, actually I'm a professor of social work, so a bit different than cruise, but I'm trained as a sociologist. I ended up taking on cruise as an area of my research about 20 years ago. I started as a cruise enthusiast, and as I spent time on cruise ships, I began to see things and I thought, well, this is kind of interesting. And when I went into the academic literature to see if people were writing about it, I found that none of it was being talked about at all. So I decided in the mid-90s that would be my area of research and writing, and that's what I've been doing now for the past 20 years, positioning myself now as an international authority on the cruise ship industry.
So how come about the establishment of this intriguing title, Cruise Junkie?
Well, when I started the website, actually, I've written 4 books and I've done 6 reports for NGOs. When I started doing my writing, I was like, how do you get your work out there? And I started the website for 2 reasons. One was to make myself visible so people would buy my books. But I think the other part was that I had generated a lot of data, as most of the academics do. And I thought to myself, why am I keeping this data private? So the website became a place where I displayed the data. So I have the only data set of people overboard, 300 people going overboard since the year 2000.
Where did the name Junkie come from?
Oh, I've done over 300 days on cruise ships. So people would call me a cruise junkie because of that.
Okay. Well, I looked up, because I always thought I have only one definition of a junkie, so I looked up the others to discover that there's a number of them, but one of them is a devotee of any sort.
Yes.
So there we are. That's it. You researched at these cruises for over the years, and there is an increase, is there, in cruises worldwide?
Oh, it's an exponential growth. I mean, if you think about in 1970, there were only 600,000 cruise passengers around the world. Today, it's over 24 million. The numbers were doubling every 10 years. Right. So it's been this exponential growth. Currently, the growth is mainly going toward China and to the South Pacific because it's an area that hasn't been very well exploited. Areas such as this region and even parts of Europe, by most predictions, are becoming saturated, where they're no longer able to expand cruise tourism. So the question is really, how is cruise tourism going to settle? And where is the industry going to kind of use for its income and for its business model?
And the customers are coming, are they? Do they come here from the Far East, or do we go there, or is it a domestic market over there?
Over there, it's both domestic as well as people flying over. Each of the large cruise lines have their own Chinese equivalent, and they're marketing themselves to China. So it's become a very large business, but they're also marketing to North Americans and others who want to visit China and other parts of the Southeast Asia.
So when you do your research, are you researching the availability, or are you looking at whether cruises are a value for money, or the impact of them in other ways?
Well, my research is very broad. So I study the industry comprehensively. So I've studied things like crime on cruise ships. I study the business model. Right now, I'm involved with a team. We're studying the economic impact of cruise ships visiting Eastern Canada. We're doing surveys now for a second year in 4 major ports where cruise ships visit in Atlantic Canada.
Right. Now, your research has led you any conclusions as to whether cruises are a good thing or a bad thing in general?
I try not to take that kind of a position, particularly when I'm coming to a place as lovely as the Island of Man. I mean, the island is wonderful, and the people have just been so warm and welcoming. I try not to kind of tell people what they should do because I'm an outsider. It's not my position.
But would you describe your role in general as an industry watchdog?
That may be a fair way, but I think it's more, as an academic, I share my knowledge. And my concern is that very often when ports are looking at the developing cruise tourism, they get a lot of information from the cruise industry, which is fine, but the industry has its own self-interest. I present the counterbalance. I can give the other side, not to say you shouldn't do it, but instead of looking at everything as rosy colored, let's look at some of the concerns, some of the things that may be problems down the road. And not that this says don't develop cruise tourism, but be forewarned of some of the problems you might be able to avoid.
So the upside and the downside.
Exactly.
Right. This is Sunday Opinion, and in today's programme we're discussing both the likely advantages and disadvantages to the Isle of Man, its economy and environment, by a significant increase in the number of cruise ships calling at the island. Our studio guests in Douglas are Dr Ross Klein from the Memorial University of Newfoundland, whose website Cruise Junkie dwells a great deal and great detail on all aspects of the cruise industry worldwide. The Minister for Enterprise, MHK Laurence Skelly, the Chairman of the Isle of Man Shipping Association, Mark Robertshaw, and Peter Verstage of the Positive Action Group. And now waiting for us, patiently at BBC Radio Orkney is the Business Development Manager for Marine Services in Orkney, Michael Morrison. Welcome back, Michael.
Thank you very much indeed.
Michael, you've been listening to our studio guests there with their mixed views on the cruise industry and its potential value to the Isle of Man. Now, you've got first-hand experience of some of the things we're talking about. 2017, as we discussed earlier, sounds like it was a good year for you, and you've grown a lot in the 6 years, from 36,000 to about 130,000. What is it about Orkney that's turned it into one of these top cruise destinations?
I don't think it's down to one thing in particular. I think we can attribute it to the fact that we have the pier in place. We have 385 metres of quay edge with 10.5 metre draft, so that's very attractive to the ships. We have a fantastic product. Mark was talking earlier about the various things that are deliverable in the Isle of Man from a tourism perspective. The product is hugely important, and diversity of product is hugely important. But on top of that, we've got the people who are passionate about delivering this and who are passionate about receiving crews. So in some respects, you've got the perfect recipe, really.
Well, the deep water harbour and berth, we've been talking here about some considerable cost of doing this, not in the harbour. Various sums of money have been talked about, from 25 to 50 million pounds. Did Orkney make that sort of investment?
No. Our main pier is the largest commercial deep water berth in Scotland at Hatston, just a couple of miles outside Kirkwall. It was built in two phases. The pier itself is not dedicated to cruise. It's a multi-purpose berth for cruise, but for oil and gas vessels, passenger and freight. And the whole thing, a total cost around about £22 million.
Right, that was, how many years ago was that?
It started in 2007, part one, and then part two was constructed in 2013-2014.
Yes, and how was that financed?
It was financed through the local authority, because the port is part of the local authority, and also with European funding. This is
the European Union grants?
Yes, ERDF, European Regional Development Fund.
Of course, which we are not in any way eligible to have over here.
No.
Now, one of the issues that keeps being raised by people when we were to have something of this nature are the maintenance costs. I mean, are they high?
They're not high. We have a maintenance programme for all of our 28 piers and harbours here, but they are more than covered from the revenues we receive. And which kind of leads me into the first question. I'm not sure just how big the piers that you want to build in the Isle of Man. Can anyone clarify that? How long is it going to be?
Yeah, ideally we're looking at sort of 400 to 450, again to future-proof the Isle of Man for the larger cruise ships, although there has been talk in recent studies about it being 350.
350 metres?
Yeah.
Okay, because that will determine obviously the size of the ships that will come alongside. So if you're building 350 metres, you'll probably be able to accommodate some of the bigger ships there.
And what about the draft in the bay? Because it's parts of the bay quite shallow, aren't they, Mark?
The draft where the vessels will be going will be more than capable of taking the largest cruise ship. Accounting for the tidal range that we have in the Isle of Man as well. There's been some initial analysis of some consultants have come over and they said that's completely possible.
Right, Michael, as far as the other aspect here, that we were talking about the value to our local economy and the value to your local economy. Now, we hear varying stories from various sources in Orkney, from it's a very good thing to not so good. I mean, what is the situation as you see it?
The cruise industry has grown exponentially here over the last 5 years, and we're now at a position whereby we're having 145 ships booked per season, delivering potentially around about 130,000 passengers. Now, we have been through a lot of the pain that you're going through over there in the Isle of Man in terms of what infrastructure is needed. Will the people all come ashore? Will they spend money? Will they come back? And I completely understand both sides of the argument that has been voiced this morning. I can only talk from the experience that we have here firsthand. And the first thing I would say is that you can survey and analyse passenger spend till the cows come home. It is not an exact science. You'll never really understand how much they spend. And it's been a source of frustration for us because people draw comparisons between the heads on beds market and the day visitor market. And in fact, for next year, we will have more day visitors in Orkney than we will have heads on beds, not just through cruise, but through maritime tourism across the board. But what we have found, based on hard evidence that we've gathered through in-depth surveys is that we are receiving just over £2 million in cruise-related harbour dues to the ports of Hatston and the other smaller ports in Orkney. And the visitor spend from cruise ships is round about £7.5 million a year. Some local businesses make an absolute fortune from it, and they are very open in saying so. Other businesses make absolutely nothing, and it very much depends on what sort of business you have. On top of that, I think businesses have to be prepared for the disappointment element as well. And I think it was Russ who mentioned the fact that you get a cancellation and people are disappointed across the board. The cruise industry is fickle. And I would say that with all due respect to it. You never quite know what you're going to get till on the day. And when you're trying to analyse economic benefit for cruise, you have to take many things into consideration. The quality of the ship, the demography of the passenger, the country of origin of the passenger, and how long they are in port are really, really important. A ship in all day full of American tourists, by our data, spend an awful lot more than a ship from Germany in for just 6 hours. Mm-hmm. So I would exercise some caution when you're trying to draw statistics on that. The other thing I would say is that if you intend to build a pier that's going to be, 300 to 500 meters long, that's going to take a long time to build. You have to get your finance in place, you have to go through a long drawn-out process of construction, and then when that's over, you're going to have to attract the cruise industry. And I would suggest that the Isle of Man is probably 5 or 6 years away from receiving its first large ship. So during this period of time, if it's going to happen, there's a lot of work to be done in the background with local and potential stakeholders, with transport companies, with tourist guides and all of that to get up to speed on what's going to happen. Because once the ships come, and once you've let the genie out of the bottle, you're not going to stop them. If what you're offering is good, it's profitable to them, and the destination is delivering as per expectation, once you've started to receive the cruise ships, it's very, very difficult to say no. So be ready for cruise at all levels, is my recommendation to you.
You talked about fickle, of course. The one thing that fortunately has not happened in the cruise industry yet is some sort of terrorist attack. But if something like that were to occur, the natural public reluctance would probably leave all of us a bit short, wouldn't it?
Well, we have experience here in Orkney where ships have diverted itineraries who were not originally booked here because of activity in other parts of the world. They've decided to be part of the Round Britain cruise, which is extremely popular, and this is one itinerary where the Isle of Man could potentially greatly benefit from. We take security really seriously. We have lots of security initiatives in place right throughout the town and on the pier and on the coaches. You have to be very conscious of that. And we never take it for granted that being a reasonably remote island location it's taken for granted. Certainly not.
Michael, do you mind if I ask you a question if we come back to the economics of passenger spend? I'm not sure if you have taken into account, but we had one particular incident here where we actually had a Manx captain on board one of these ships, and he insisted on buying Manx produce. So, as you know, we've got some fantastic cheeses, beers, etc. here on the Isle of Man. But that resulted in a probably single sale for the Manx produce industry here in the Isle of Man, larger than anything they've had in the entire year. Do you get involved at that particular level when you consider the passenger spend? Because I know we haven't used that in our figures at this particular stage.
Oh, yeah. Well, there are two things to consider slightly under the radar from passenger spend. That is the economic benefit of supplies and stores on board from local produce. And secondly, it's crew spend, because if you have a cruise ship with 3,000 people on board, you've got 1,000 crew. And the crew spend in Kirkwall and certain shops is absolutely and totally phenomenal. In produce for the ships, a lot of the ships will buy in their main turnaround ports because to get the volume discounts, which is fully understandable. But they can be encouraged to buy locally. And I mean, one ship this year bought 4.5 tons of scallops, more than the outlet had sold the rest of the year. And of course, we've got a lot of good local produce here. With the beef and the fish and the shellfish and the cheese and ice cream, and all of that goes on board in varying quantities. So yeah, it's another element to add into your economic benefit analysis.
Quite a significant one, I would suggest.
Yeah, it is.
They had a Manx night the following night, which was quite interesting, and celebrated the Isle of Man, of which there was lots of anecdotal stories there with regards to we must go back because there's not enough to see in one day on the Isle of Man.